Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eli Mercado. I am a pre-sales data protection specialist. And today we want to talk about how we leverage VMC as a disaster recovery target. Now, many of you have heard of VMware Cloud, and when customers approach us, a lot of the conversations are around, how quickly can we start consuming this? This is our easiest way to move our data centers to the cloud. Um, and when can we turn this on? And typically in our engagement, we want to go through assessments and figure out, okay, is this the best? Is this the right way to do things? And we typically we come to the solution that VMware Cloud doesn't become my one-stop shop, right? There are more components that I need in order to make that work, and and it may not necessarily be how we want to consume VMware Cloud. And what we do here at Ahead is really talk about, how do we get to a strategy, right? And we leverage VMware Cloud, which is more of a tool, and how do we use it as a full all-in-one solution, right? And so, one of the ways, as we see, the traditional use for consuming VMware Cloud is, let's just kind of use it as a secondary data center, right? We have a lot of customers who want to shut down their second data centers, which again isn't a bad idea, right? We want to move away from having physical data centers to cloud-based data centers. The other initial use or traditional use is to lift and ship their entire data center into VMC, and then also run secondary application workloads. Some of the strategic use cases that we've developed here at Ahead is creating an automated disaster recovery target, basically leveraging continuous data protection and integrating that into VMC, right? And so with that, we can create a tiered disaster recovery solution where we can focus on critical applications failing over to VMC and lower tiered applications and fail them over to VMC. Now, when we look at some of the traditional use, right, what are some of the strengths from using VMC? One is the ease of use, right? You don't have to learn a new tool, right? It's VMware end to end mostly, but essentially you don't have to learn a brand new tool. It's essentially what we're doing is we're extending our VMware environment into the cloud without the need of having any type of infrastructure. Now, when we look at where some of the downfalls come into is we start to notice that there's a very high cost, right? And there's a very heavy resource consumption. Again, we're not saying that VMC is not the right solution. What we're saying is there's things that we need to consider when we look at a traditional AWS or Azure model. When we build virtual machines, we don't necessarily pay the full price until we're actually running those virtual machines in AWS or in Azure. In VMC, everything's on the moment you hit the go button, right? So you can consume as little as one ESX target and 10 terabytes of vCenter storage. But again, even if you don't have any VMs, you're still paying for that ESXi host to run. And you're also running for those 10 terabytes that are running, right? So it's essentially constantly in motion, right? So when we think about why do we end up with these heavy costs is because essentially we would be using VMC as a DR, a dead site, right? So we have our copies there, they're not necessarily running, and it would be cheaper. And that's not necessarily the case. Even though the virtual machines themselves, from a performance standpoint, aren't running, but you are still consuming heavy resources in AWS. Now, when we compare that, when we use VMC as a disaster recovery target with continuous data protection, is now we get into an efficient use of compute, right? We can control our costs because we choose which virtual machines we want to copy and which virtual machines we want to fail over. We can also have multiple sites where we want to fail over. We can choose AWS if we want to fail over for lower tier, and we can choose to fail over to VMC for more critical tier, right? And so now we have automated capabilities to say, okay, hey, these groups of virtual machines, they're critical infrastructure. They need to be turned on immediately for a failover. We get those running in VMC. And everything else, if we don't necessarily want to run it immediately in VMC, or there's no need to run it in VMC, we can quickly run them into AWS. And all of that is automated, right? Now, when you look at one of the biggest weaknesses, and it's tough to say one of the biggest weaknesses is there's a lot of integration with automation, right? We got to create orchestrated workflows and have automated frameworks in order to move a lot of these tools around. Now, when I say it's the weaknesses, is you have to have a resource on site, right, in order to do this. Now, the beauty is a head can actually help you with that. This is one of the things. One of our models is relentless automation, right? And so we can fill that gap for you and essentially come up with an entire strategy to use VMC as a disaster recovery target. Now, what we're going to demonstrate for you in a couple of minutes here is leveraging Dell RecoverPoint for VM. Essentially, what we'll be doing is copying over virtual machines every 90 minutes into an AWS S3 target continuously, right? So we're essentially giving some consistency to a virtual machine. We can go back as far as 90 minutes, unlike when we have on-site failover, which is anywhere between 5 minutes and a couple seconds. But this is failover to the cloud, right? Essentially, there's no site that you need. There's no spinning disk that you have to worry about. It's essentially, let me just start consuming the resources. Uh, and what we're going to show you is how RecoverPoint VM will copy over data to AWS. And I think that's what's key here, is it's copying data to AWS and consuming AWS resources, which are typically cheaper than what you would use in a VMC, right? So essentially, we're using two accounts, right, efficiently. So we don't necessarily need to build the giant data center that you would traditionally see for a failover. So we're storing all our data in AWS S3 and EC2, and when it's time to fail over, we're gonna demonstrate how RecoverPoint for VM integrated with Cloud Disaster Recovery would fail over those point-in-time copies into VMC or fail them over to AWS. Now, just so you can kind of see the components that we're going to have here. So we have on-prem RecoverPoint for VM 5.3. We're running VMware 6.7. In the cloud, we have Cloud Disaster Recovery Server running version 19.7 and AWS and EC2. So that's what those are two components that we're consuming. That's where RecoverPoint is writing to. We're not writing directly to VMC. In our SDDC, we have VMware Cloud version 7.0. We also have a proxy, which is they call it a Cloud Disaster Recovery Appliance, which acts as a proxy, gives us the credentials to log into VMC and fail over. We have version 19.7. And without further ado, we'll start our demo. Thank you. So first things first, we have to make sure that we have RecoverPoint for VMs running within your environment. In the current version, RecoverPoint for VM 5.3, it still requires the vSphere web client. There is a tool that you can use that will allow you to deploy it. As we know, Flash has been deprecated since December 2020. So you do have to use a web client, although in version 5.4, that is moving all to HTML. All right, so once we're here, once we have RecoverPoint built, we need to go ahead and connect our cloud services from our on-prem RecoverPoint to AWS. So it's very straightforward. We need to have a snap replication data store established. So typically one is created by default, but you can add one here. We would go ahead and add our AWS account, which requires a account key and a secret key. Once you have that, the RecoverPoint for VMware appliance is able to detect the buckets and resources available that are in your cloud. So we're using this S3 bucket called CDR version 7. And currently we're using only about 23 gigs because essentially what RecoverPoint is going to be doing is replicating virtual machine snapshots to S3, right? So we're technically still not consuming any VMC yet. We're replicating everything in S3, which is still cheaper than running an entire virtual machine in VMC, which requires compute, storage, and networking. And we actually want it that way, right? We want to have the ability to control what we have spinning in VMC and then identifying which workloads we want to replicate to AWS and fail them over into VMC. And finally, we would connect to our cloud disaster recovery server, which is built in AWS. Now, there's a couple different ways. We built CDRS ahead of time, but if one isn't built and your RecoverPoint server won't detect it because it's not built, once you click Add, it will actually ask you where do you want to build it. So RecoverPoint for VM will actually deploy CDRS for you. We have it built because we are also using cloud disaster recovery for IDPAs. So our proxy that lives on-prem in VMware is what actually built CDRS for us, and we're using the same instance. You can use multiple proxies to write this to CDRS in AWS, which meaning I can write backups. I can copy backups to AWS as well as VM snapshots with RecoverPoint. So we don't have to have multiple instances in the cloud. We just need that one instance and it'll be able to ingest all of that data. All right. So now that we have our cloud buckets established, we'll actually have we'll have a cloud target. Now, in order to do that with RecoverPoint for VM, you can see we already have a virtual machine right now being protected, demo 1, and it has a consistency group. So we're going to do a couple things here. We're going to add virtual machines to an existing consistency group, and then we're going to create a new consistency group so that you can see the differences between the two. Now, first things first, let's go ahead and create a new consistency group so you can see the overall process of protecting virtual machines in the cloud here. Let's go ahead and pick through our virtual machines here. We have a list of machines here. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and choose this one here. And then if we right click, we're going to see here, protect. Now you're going to see two options, right? Create a new consistency group for this VM or add to an existing consistency group. For the sake of the demo, we want to create a new one just so you can see the overall process of adding virtual machines into a protection group and actually protect and copy them to the cloud. So we'll call this guy demo 01, right? By default, it picks our RecoverPoint appliance here. We're going to go ahead and click next. All right, we're going to call the production copy, we'll call it prod demo. So typically you could just choose whatever registered data store from the bottom, but we have to make sure that we choose the correct one for our sakes because we have different practices that use different components of VMware and want to make sure that we're not actually using some of their data centers. It's more our lab than it is yours, but you can use anything you want. All right, not much to change here. Typically, we leave all of this by default. The difference is here, right, is now we have to add a copy, and we can say AWS Ohio, right? We'll call it that copy. So we have two options here. We can replicate this to VMware vCenter, which is traditional RecoverPoint replication, or now that we have added our cloud account, we have AWS Cloud. So what we want to do is we want to make sure our copy type is AWS Cloud. Now you can also you can add a cloud copy to an existing consistency group. So if your consistency group is replicating to another data center, you can add another copy to replicate to the cloud. So there's multiple ways that you can replicate RecoverPoint. Doesn't necessarily have to be a separate consistency group that replicates to the cloud. You can have an existing consistency group, add an additional copy to the cloud. We're going to go ahead and click next. Now that we have our data store, here's where our journal snapshots are going to be held. Now, I want you to remember here that we set an RPO, right? Our recovery point objective. So for recovery RP4 VM copying to the cloud, the minimum RPO that you can have is 90 minutes, so an hour and a half, right? So essentially, we will have within 90-minute intervals copying every single 90 minutes to the cloud. Typically, a retention policy, we set them to something a lot lower than 5 days, because technically what we're trying to do is understand is we're going to have almost 20 copies of our virtual machine existing in the cloud, right? Because we're doing in those 90-minute intervals, and we typically see customers protecting them for about 2 days, right? So essentially, you end up with 40 different rollback points. Now, again, based on different RTOs and RPOs that are requirements for different workloads, we can make those adjustments and keep them for longer. But typically, we don't want to go past 5 days because at that point, we would leverage an IDPA or Avamar and recover from last night's backup, right? Because essentially, we've already lost so much data. It makes sense to just go back to the last backup. So again, this is more disaster recovery, not data protection, right? This is continuous data protection, not traditional data protection. We're actually continuously protecting, making multiple copies in the cloud, and it's more like a DR failover than it is data protection. All right, so we're going to go ahead and click next, right? And it's kind of just making sure that the connectivity to the cloud is all set. Is this the right bucket here? I think what I want you to show you here is we're actually replicating these to S3, right? We've mentioned that before. I want to make sure that that distinction is made very, very clear because we don't necessarily want to consume all of the resources in VMC yet, right? Because the idea is to start small, and then as your failover gets bigger and bigger, VMC can gradually grow along with your failovers, right? So essentially, we're leveraging cheaper storage, cheaper compute to house our copies. And then when we're ready, we are mounting VMs and rehydrating them so that they would be available in VMC. So here, we're going to go ahead and click next, right? Just kind of giving you an overview of what's going on, right? Start replicating as soon as I hit copy. And this is where we're talking about adding a copy, right? I can go to another VMware on-prem data center if I wanted to. But for this case, we're just going to go straight to the cloud. Go ahead and click protect, right? And RecoverPoint is going to make some modifications to the VM itself. And then we'll slowly start seeing the consistency group being deployed. All right. And we can see here that it's slowly being deployed here. It does take a little bit of time because it's making some adjustments to the virtual machine. But once it's made the changes to the virtual machine, you'll start to see that it's being protected. And you can already see it's being, it's showing up as a list of virtual machines that you're actually protecting under RecoverPoint for VM. So the next thing I want to show you is how do we add to existing clusters or consistency groups, sorry. So we would just basically just go right back to our data center here. What we want to do is we want to go ahead and choose this guy, and we're going to add it to its existing consistency group, right? So essentially we're not creating a new one, but just, so that you can see the differences, in capabilities when it comes to RP4 VM. So here, what we're having here is, it says, hey, I want to add it to an existing consistency group. You see here, we have two different groups here. We're going to want to go ahead and choose the first one that we had here. We're going to go ahead and click next. All right. And then it's basically go through some of the same things that, hey, we've already configured, where we want it to go because the copies are all going to cloud. It's just saying, any of the advanced features, changes, options that you want. Typically, we don't change much of this. We'll go ahead and click next. All right, it's showing you that it's a cloud copy. We just kind of keep going, and then, click no, protect, and boom, there it goes. Right here, and then so we go back to RecoverPoint. Again, I know I'm bouncing around, but it's just to show you, that it's actually showing up, right? It's actually being protected here. All right, and so this is actually our data center in our 401 headquarters. We do have multiple types of applications and appliances running in our lab. We use it for multiple purposes. We use it for anything like testing, for testing our deployments, testing for performance, validating whether these applications can do what they said to do. How can we leverage different types of integrations? It's actually also where we in our lab is also where we developed our integration into ServiceNow with Avamar. So, just putting it out there, if you have more questions about our lab, things that you can use, please reach out to your client directors um, to find out about all of our options in our lab. All right, so we're seeing here are two consistency groups, right? So now you can see that it's actually replicating a snapshot, right? Because we added that virtual machine into that consistency group. And it's also, the second one is also copying into the cloud. Now, what we could do now is this server here is actually built in AWS. I'll kind of show you here real quick. This is the CDRS instance that we built into the cloud. It actually lives in AWS, and it's writing its storage to S3. I want to point something out here is each of these virtual machines are anywhere between 60 gigs, 80 gigs, and 120 gigs. We are not copying all the ones and zeros, or all that blank space. We're only copying the used capacity into the cloud, right? So again, we're using capacity more efficiently. Essentially, we want to only use what we need. We don't necessarily need to store all of this data. We don't necessarily need to store all of the data that for the virtual machine, right? Because it's all of the metadata is there. And if we look here, go ahead and click protection. We notice here that all of our virtual machines that we've added are being copied into the cloud, right? You can actually, once you scroll over them, you can see all the different, excuse me, you can see all of the different statuses that are, whether it's 11%, you can see all the latest copies, right? Say, hey, my last copy was 44 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago. As I said before, the minimum RPO is 90 minutes, okay? So every hour and a half, we will have a copy running, copying to the cloud. Now, again, still haven't really recovered, we're not using VMC yet, right? This is all just RecoverPoint copying data into AWS. Now, I want to just show you our software-defined data center here. So you can see here that this is VMC in the cloud. We're only running a single host, right? And that's the point is, now granted, your environment may be different, right? So your initial go round, you can say, hey, maybe I need 3 hosts because I want to be able to spin up 15% of my environment in VMC without necessarily needing to expand it, right? So you can always go with the minimum number needed. You'll have possibly some small virtual machines, whether it's AWS, sorry, whether it's Active Directory, DNS, NTP, anything like that, that would help, that you are required for disaster recovery. You would have them running small. So essentially, you're only paying what you're using, right? We don't necessarily need to have a full-blown SDDC that mirrors your existing production environment. We're essentially using it as a DR target, right? So here, you can see here, this is our cluster. And this is what I was talking about before, the proxy that would live in VMC. So this is what facilitates the connection from VMC to AWS. So a couple of things. This can connect 2 ways. It can connect over the public subnet if needed, which is not a good practice, but also through a private subnet, right? So as you know, you can tie your VPC to your specific SDDC. So we would assist creating those management groups and private connections between the two so that we would facilitate those connections there. All right, so now let's actually go ahead and fail a machine over. Um, so just as a reference, it does take about 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the size of the virtual machine to bring online. Let's go ahead and log back in. All right, one of the wonders of doing live demos here. So we're logging back here, and let's go ahead and choose a machine to um, recover or fail over into VMC. Oh, but I guess before we do that, I want to show you some of the components here. So this is the proxy appliance that we use for Avamar IDPA to replicate to the cloud. So we're using the CDRS server that lives in the cloud to copy also our backups, right? And then here's our RPA, our recovery point for VMware appliance, right? So it acts as its own proxy. And so that's what's actually connecting. You can see all the IPs and connectivity between them. And so this is the VMC appliance that's living up there, right? So you can see here, here's the vCenter that we're connecting to. Here's the internal IPs for the VMC appliance, and then which targets they're connecting to, right? A lot of these names are very generic, right? It just helps us describe what we're connecting to. So let's go ahead and fail something over. All right. So you can see here, right? So we have two machines here. This one hasn't completely copied in, but possibly maybe after we start our recover, uh, we can see one of them go over. Let's see here, asset recovery. Let's choose one of our machines. So you're going to see a couple options here, right? So you have a DR test where essentially it tests whether it's kind of like running an audit, right? Make sure the connection is there. Can it mount something? Can it mount the OVA? Can it rehydrate the machine? And so essentially, you're not necessarily failing over, but you can test it. The second option here is to fail over, right? So you have two options here. And we really like this because this gives you the option to restore virtual machines into AWS, right? So typically those machines, because it takes a little bit longer to fail over to AWS, because essentially what we're doing is converting a VMDK to an EC2 disk, right? So CDR will facilitate that conversion. So essentially what it'll do is it'll start rehydrating that VMDK, converting it into an EC2, and then booting it up, right? So essentially you can actually do this via a DR plan, right? So if you have a bunch of virtual machines, let's just say, again, tier 2, tier 3 that you want to fail over to AWS, you would be able to do it go through this procedure. But for this particular demo, we're going to do is fail over to vCenter. This will typically not show up until we have an appliance configured in our target, right? So that was this piece here. We're going to go ahead and choose the machine that we had recently copied into the cloud. So you can see here, this is our most recent point in time copy, gives you a timestamp. We chose to fail over to vCenter, right? So you can see the source, right? It's showing you the proxy that we have living in the SDDC and then the SDDC target. Go ahead and click next. Click next, and we're going to start that recovery, right? And you can see right here, right? So I actually had a couple of it had a couple of failovers running. It's still we're canceled. We canceled them because we actually finished the recovery. Well, I want to show you a couple of things that are going to happen here, right? So if we look here, so we're going to go into our VMC CDR SDDC. Let's go ahead and so what's going to happen here is EMC Cloud Disaster Recovery Server is going to mount a OVA, which essentially becomes a pilot server, right? So that virtual machine will boot up in CentOS and then initiate a file transfer from another virtual machine that lives in AWS, right? So essentially, and there it goes here, right? And so we can see here This is actually Cloud Disaster Recovery deploying that OVF template. So what it's actually doing here is mounting it, like I said before, off of an OVA, and it creates this CentOS server. And so once it's built, it actually starts the file transfer. And so there's a couple things that I'm going to show here. So we're just going to let this fast forward. Maybe fast forward this a little bit here. I always like to show the events because it's showing everything that is pertaining to the VM. So again, this is all done through orchestration with Cloud Disaster Recovery. So there's nothing we would have to do from this point. Once it initiates, CDR takes over and then runs the entire machine. So you can see that it's actually powering it on and initiating those file transfers. So here is this next part here, we're kind of watching paint dry a little bit. You're going to see this jump up into 24%. So we're going to use the magic of recording demos to fast forward a little bit. So once this is running here, I'm going to switch over to AWS, and so you can see the other pilot server get deployed into deployed into AWS, right? And so we can see here, you see here that CDRS, this is the pilot server, right? So this is actually using orchestration to create the server. It's actually will, and this is the server that S3 is actually mounting to. So it's actually transferring the files from this pilot server right into the server that lives in VMC. The beauty here is that the only thing we're doing is just rehydrating the data. We are not converting the VMDKs from VMDK to EC2. Everything is staying in the same format. So essentially, all we're doing is rehydrating the files that are coming out of S3. And so what we'll see here is in the events is a file transfer will initiate, right? Just gonna kind of go back here. So it's still booting this server up. It's not completely up. So right now we're just going to kind of let it run through its thing, and then we're going to wait on the SDD size until we see a file transfer commence. So we're going to just fast forward a little bit, take a quick pause, and let that fast forward. All right, folks. You can already see here, it initiated that file transfer right from the guest. So essentially, like I said, this restore server, this pilot server, has the S3 backup actually tied to it and is replicating that, or not replicating, sorry, rehydrating that back into VMC. Now, we could kind of go through this and let it run, but essentially, right from here, what CDR is going to do is it's going to down the server again once the rehydration is complete, and then start it up again, and you'll see this guest operating system change from CentOS to Windows. And then from there, you'll be able to do whatever you need to the virtual machine, to the virtual machine once it's running. So again, all of this will progress through, but I just want to make sure that you guys were able to see how RecoverPoint replicates data into AWS and houses it there. And then when it's time for the disaster, right, we've lost our DR center, we would go into the cloud DR server, which lives in the cloud, right? So it can survive our production failure, and we would automate the failover from there, right? So essentially, we see how RecoverPoint replicates data into our CDR server that lives in the cloud. And it's actually putting that data into S3. And then once it's time to recover, we are actually replicating that over. Now, again, this is to show that there are multiple use cases for VMC, right? We don't necessarily want to always lift and ship data or virtual machines into this VMC, which is actually using it as a DR target. I hope this was useful to you guys. I want to thank you for your time. If you have any more questions or want to see this demo live, please reach out to your client directors or client solutions architect to schedule some time. Beyond this, we have multiple other products that we can demo in our lab. allow you to do proof of concepts. We can do demonstrations. We can also give you some time to test within our own environments. So again, thank you for your time, and thank you for visiting ahead.